Welcome to the Writing Corner with Authors Alcove. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Polly Holyoke, the talented author behind Skyrider, which is published through Viking books for young readers, and the Neptune series, which is published through Disney and Hyperion. You can learn more about Polly and her work on her website, pollyholyoke.com. She grew up in the Colorado mountains, enjoying outdoor adventures like hiking, skiing, camping. As a former social studies teacher, Polly has always had a deep love for books and reading. Her passion for writing began in 5th grade when she penned her first story, 2 Days at Eagle Pass Ranch, with her best friend. This early experience, even though the story was never published, ignited her dedication to storytelling. Thank you again, Polly, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for hosting me. I am looking forward to our talk.
Before we begin talking about your book, I actually want to know a little bit about you and what got you into the writing world.
So I was a big reader for sure. I was one of those kids that read and read and read. In fact, I think my mother was getting a little worried about how much reading I was doing about the time I was in 7th grade. And I read a lot of horse books. And so she finally helped me buy a horse. Well, that was all well and good, except that I fell off the horse 6 weeks after we bought the horse. And at school, when you have a broken arm and you can't go to PE, you know where they send you? They send you to the library. I did more reading, but no. And my grandma read to me, and people in my life just read books. And so I was a school teacher, and I had those summers free. And as much as I loved my kids, I was not that excited about the idea of teaching summer school. And I just couldn't sit around doing nothing in my summer. So that's when I started writing books. And it took a little while to figure out. I'm very self-taught. And so it took me a little while how to figure out how to put a book in a marketable, sellable envelope. But once I did, then I started selling pretty regularly. So I know that you have lots of writers that listen to your podcast. And so one piece of advice is I do believe in MFAs. I do not have one. I think I would have gotten where I am a whole lot faster if I hadn't been sort of learning how to write. First, I maybe wrote romance, which we're not going to talk much about. And then I started writing children's fiction. And there are professional groups for every kind of writing under the sun. So those professional groups, even if you don't go get a master's in fine arts, certainly join if you want to write romance novels, join RWA, Romance Writers of America. If you want to write children's books, the big organization for that is the Society of Children's Books Writers and Illustrators. Terrible acronym, SCBWI, but a really wonderful organization. And they have all kinds of conferences, they have local chapters. It's a great way to connect with other writers and be taught by writers who are higher up the food chain and more experienced than you are.
So I definitely want to talk more about the publishing aspect in a little bit, but first I want to hear a little bit about the books that you have written. So you have the Neptune Trilogy first. And so first I just want to know, just recap as best you can without giving away any spoilers of that particular trilogy.
Okay, so the Neptune Trilogy, they were just so much fun to write. I wanted to write a dystopian novel. The Hunger Games was really popular, and I thought, well, I want to do something different. And really, dystopian is a flavor of science fiction. So, okay, I'm going to do something about kids in the future. I'm really worried about climate change. I was worried about genetic engineering. I mean, really beautiful, amazing things are coming out of that, but also really scary things. And so it sort of came to me, what if kids had to go live in the ocean because climate change is out of control? And these kids had to actually breathe seawater because they've been genetically engineered by their scientist parents to breathe seawater. But you couldn't have a baby go live in the sea. So you'd have to, wait till the kids are about 12 or 13 or 14 to get a shot, wakes up some gill filaments in their lungs, and then they can breathe seawater. And that also opens up the picture for some real conflict, because what if you don't know you're going to be a sea kid and your parents hide this from you, and then when you get 12 or 13, somebody says, you've got to go live in the ocean and you're not coming back. And that's basically what happens to these kids. And then a really fun offshoot of it was I was trying to figure out how kids could talk underwater. This is part of world building, which I really love doing. I was like, okay, well, our voices don't work very well underwater. We need oxygen to flow over our air to go over our vocal cords. So I decided these kids would be telepaths. Then I had to figure out the rules to telepathy. And then I decided, guess what? Dolphins are telepathic. And so then the dolphins that my heroine there trains, when she goes into the ocean, they stay with these kids and they help protect the kids. They kind of help become part of their transportation sometimes when there are really strong currents in the water. And so it turned into a 3-book series, and it won the state award, the Sunshine State Award in Florida. Kids there voted it their favorite book. So it did well. It had a lot of STEM elements, which was fun. Even though I did write what I don't know. I've never been genetically engineered, and I didn't even do high school biology. So I ended up talking to lots of really smart scientists and doctors to make the Neptune project as believable as possible. And then the current series is Skyriders, which is being published by Viking Children's Books. And the whole premise on that's another really wild, fun premise. I like to see that Skyriders was inspired by the American Pony Express and the Pegasus myth. And so it's a story of brave young couriers on their flying horses delivering the mail across a vast empire. And then things are going great for my heroine, Kai. She loves her sky steed, her flying horse. They're called sky steeds. And she can communicate, she can speak with her flying horse. But then these terrible 3-headed monsters called Chimera return. And Chimera is what Bellerophon and Pegasus fought in the original Pegasus myth. So it's a 3-headed monster that flies and breathes fire. So Kai actually knows how to fight these things because she has an eccentric uncle who believes the Chimera are returning. They almost destroyed the empire 300 years ago. Everybody thinks they're long gone, but this one man has held on to a fighting manual from ages ago, and he's made his niece practice sky fighting. So suddenly this very shy girl from the fringes of the empire is thrown right into the maelstrom and into the hotspot because she has to take that manual to the capital and get people in power to listen to her. And that's a pretty tall order for a shy kid from the fringes of the empire who just happens to have dyslexia. So that's the first book of Skyriders, and I'm really excited because the second book just came out. I like to say that's the origin story of the Sky Steeds, and that came out in May. And Skyriders just made Bank Street's best children's books of 2024. So I just made a couple state lists so far. So I guess it's pretty well written. I'm certainly had a lot of fun writing.
That's awesome. So as a former 7th grade teacher, how has that experience? So first of all, what did you teach in 7th grade? Was it English?
No, I was a history teacher, which still has the English teachers at my old school laughing, like, how did she go off and do this?
That was me too. I'm a history teacher.
There we go. No, I've always loved history. Hard to sell historicals. We could talk about that. That's a good side story or a place we could go talking about writing historicals for kids. I think that the main thing that writing for 7th grade helped me with is to just, when you write for kids, you've got to put yourself back in that mindset. You've got to remember what you cared about in 7th grade. Or if you're writing for upper elementary, you need to really remember what were your big issues in 5th grade and 6th grade. You've got to time travel and be in touch with your inner kiddo. Certainly, it's a great advantage for teachers and for parents who have kids at home that are in those ages, because you just get a sense of what they care about. You also get a sense for how they speak. If you're going to write contemporary fiction for upper elementary and for middle school, it's great if you know how they talk. But here's the big problem is you can't really say how they talk because the publishers won't accept it. If you walk down the hallway of any school and you hear how 5th graders and 6th graders swear, 7th and 8th graders get very colorful with their language. Each publishing has their set of rules for what you can use. And literally at Disney Hyperion, we couldn't use the word crap. So at one point I had my character saying, "Oh, crud." just, I mean, it would have been unbelievable for them to even say, "Oh, crap." So finding the right language for kids is an ongoing challenge. Some people make up their own slang, especially if you're doing dystopia and you're doing futuristic stuff. The guy who wrote The Maze Runner, James Dashner, is amazing at making futuristic slang. I know I'm not so good at it, so I just put a little bit of it in. Somebody like Suzanne Collins, who wrote The Hunger Games, there's no slang. They don't have any slang for what happens in the Hunger Games, and you can get by without it. But you should be aware that if you do use slang, and certainly in a contemporary book, if you use slang, you have to be careful, because right now everything that's really cool is really sick, right? But that's going to change in a couple of years. So if you have kids going around going say, "Whoa, that's really sick," it won't make a lot of sense to kids 5 years from now. So that's one of those interesting little problems is how do you I think you want to use slang that is forever slang, like cool. And maybe your character has some idiosyncratic slang words that she's made up or he's made up, and you can get by with that. Something this kid says, maybe not everybody says, but what this kid says when they're under stress or something's really cool, really, really fabulous going on. But yeah, so that's it. One of the great advantages of being a seventh grade teacher is having an ear open and listening to all that.
That's awesome. So one of the things I was really intrigued about what that you were talking about is you were actually both a traditional published and a indie writer as well. Can you explain your experiences and why you may choose traditional for children's or middle grade?
Yeah, so I am a fan. I mean, I think that independent publishing, self-publishing is a fabulous thing. And I think it's writers are exploited in so many ways. I mean, it's wonderful we have publishers, but when you see what the tiny percentages of the profits that we receive for the amount of time you put in, I'm cheering for the folks that are independently published and doing well. It is easier to be successful as an adult writer for adult fiction in the independent market than it is as for kids. And that it's really the way the whole system works. So if you want to sell a children's book and be successful, you really need to have school librarians on your side. Well, how does school librarians find out about your book? They find out about it through the big trade educational journals like School Library Journal, the Horn Book, Book List, Kirkus, right? And if you don't get good reviews from those sources, that's number one. That's the first way you break in. I know librarians, school librarians who order every single starred book. They'll look at who has the starred reviews and they order all of them because maybe they don't have time to read all those books. All right, so it is hard to get reviewed by those journals. The only place, Kirkus, I believe you can pay. If you're independently published, you might be able to pay for a review in Kirkus. Then they're also the gatekeepers because kids don't really know about books. They find out about books from their friends. How do their friends find out about books? They find out what they read in the library. How do the books get into libraries? Through these school librarians who have read these reviews or have gotten some kind of recommendation from a state committee. What are state committees? Well, it turns out almost every state has got a group of passionate librarians, bless their hearts. They're working full-time in schools and public libraries, and then on the side, they read hundreds of books. And they generate these lists that then become the recommended lists every given year. So I was fortunate enough to have the Neptune Project become, listed on Florida state list, the Texas state list, Maryland, Ohio, some other places. And that means that librarians in those places actually create these lists and say, yes, 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 everybody should read these in your school. It's like a big reading incentive program. So it's great for the kids, but it's also really nice for authors that gets their books right into the schools and into kids' hands. Just a funny side note, I always say that state lists are a little bit like the Electoral College. There's some of the small states. It's really lovely to make the Vermont list. It's a very literary list and it's very prestigious, but you sell a few more books if you make the Texas list or you make the Florida list because your book is, in so many more schools. So I don't know of any independently published books that have made big state lists. It will happen eventually. It's possible, but if you have a good story and it's in very professional shape, which it needs to be before you're going to self-publish it anyway, I always say, why not try New York? Maybe you have to spend a couple of years trying to get there. You're going to spend a couple of years getting yourself a great agent. I think it's almost 80% of all the fiction published in New York now goes through agents. That was not the case when I started out, but it is the case now. So you do have to have a literary agent, right? That takes time. But once you get a good agent on your side, then you can go ahead and send your stuff to the big publishers. Maybe it doesn't make it. Then you can always independently publish. But I think you are kind of shooting yourself in the foot in the kidlit market if you don't try for New York first, because those publishers have got the resources. They have marketing. They send you to conferences where you meet the librarians. And again, librarians are really the gatekeepers of children's fiction. And how do those librarians find out about you if you're self-published? It's a tough challenge to get on their radar.
So how did you find your agent?
How did I find my agent? Well, let's see. How did I find Doug? I really read Publishers Weekly, and they have a section called the Deal Makers page. I had for years just been reading, I'm old enough that there used to be books about literary agents, and you would read the books about literary agents. And then, more and more things started to go online. And Publishers Weekly, I think it's $25 a month. And if you are actively shopping for agents, I am a huge fan of this because the Dealmakers database, what you can do is you can put in the name of the agent you're interested in, you'll want to find out about, and you can find out how many books they've sold in the last 6 months, how many books they've sold in the last 2 years, the elevator pitch for each of those books, the editor that bought the book. And so I found Doug, my first kid agent, I knew I had Neptune Project was this really cool idea. I knew it was dystopian, but was with a unique flavor. It was going to be set almost entirely in the ocean. So I was looking for an agent who had represented dystopian fiction with a twist. And he had recently sold a book where I think maybe caffeine was a very scarce resource, like spice and Dune or something. I don't know. But I remember thinking, whoa, that's a really weird twist. That's interesting. Maybe he'd like the Neptune Project. And indeed, he took it on and we sold at auction and we had media agents talking about movies. It was all very exciting. So the deal makers page, it's subsection where you can actually manipulate and read about these agents and see. There were agents on that list that I thought were a really big deal that had sold very few books in the course of a year. And there were agents I had never heard of that were selling 20 middle grade books and 10 picture books. It was like, I've never even heard of this person. So it's an interesting resource, and I think it's a very valuable one. I wouldn't pay $25 a year all year round, but I would, if you're actively agent searching, then it might be worth your $25 a month.
That's awesome. And you said that, librarians are our gatekeepers. How do you reach out to them? Is that something that your agent does or the publisher does, or do you have to actively reach out to these schools that you're going to?
It happens on a macro and a micro level. Your publisher is doing it on the macro level. So if you're really lucky and you've written just an amazing book, they might send you to ALA, which is, the American Library Association conference. That's the big gig. You're really excited if you get offered to go to that. And then they might send you to some of the smaller conferences. Smaller, TLA is not smaller, but Texas Library Association is like the third biggest library conference. And so maybe they will send you. If they won't send you, then you start writing program proposals and get yourself invited to the party, which is what I've done in Florida and Texas and Colorado multiple times. You find what it is that you've got an expertise in. For me, it's doing school visits. I'm actually up around 450 at this point. So I can talk about a good school visit, and I also talk about ways to get kids writing, because I've seen so many amazing writing programs in the various schools I've gone to. But if you can get yourself on the program, then the librarians find out about you. And a lot of times they'll put your books in their conference store. So librarians are seeing your stuff there. So that's one way to reach librarians that you can make a difference, that you can do. And then locally, I maintain a list of librarians in my county. I hire high school kids to look up the email addresses of librarians in big cities near me. And then when I'm ready to do school visits, I usually send out an email blast to those librarians and say, hey, this is my background. I actually can teach when I come to your school. These are my books. You have to squish this all together. It's a tough letter to write, but I've done it enough times. And then so I get myself a lot of sort of in-state school visits that way.
And what does a visit look like?
Oh, they're so much fun. It depends on the school and how organized your hosting librarian or PTO parent is. But I'll teach 4 sections in a day. I usually give a couple of assemblies. I have an assembly for K through 2 about dolphins, right? So they're not ready to read the Neptune Project. It's really an older book. But I found out that I know a lot about dolphins, and it becomes an excellent vehicle for teaching elementary schools science concepts like habitat and characteristics of mammals. And I get to play with my marine puppets at the end of it. And then my next assembly is really for 3rd through 8th graders. That's where I have my message about read, write, unplug from the gadgets, leave time to daydream. And then I also teach writing workshops because I really am a teacher. And so it's very comfortable for me to go in and teach a little writing workshop about using better verbs and nouns. And the ELA teachers seem to love that. There's a lot of pressure on these teachers now to have great test scores. And so if you can bill yourself as a teaching author, it makes it easier for them to get funding from their principals to get you into schools. And then what I really love to do is have lunch with kids, a special group of kids who really love writing and are really interested in publishing. And you'd be surprised how many kiddos out there are interested in writing. And so I wish when I was little, I'd had a chance to talk directly in a one-on-one or with a group of 20 kids and one author. So I try to make myself available for that when I can.
Do you have a memorable experience that you'd like to share from your times in the schools?
Well, there was the time I almost choked. I did choke. I was talking to a book club at a Christian school in Dallas. Oh my gosh, this wonderful librarian. So moral of the story, do not talk and eat your lunch at the same time. So I sucked in a part of a sandwich. I got a complete blockage. I'd always read about it. All of a sudden I was going like, it was like, oh my gosh, I think I'm choking. So I stood up quietly because I didn't want to freak out the kids. I was going to throw myself over the back of a chair, which is you hit your diaphragm, you try to break the suction. And one of the librarians heard me going, she said, are you choking? I said, yes. She said, do you need the Heimlich? And I'm going, yes. Except I was saying, eh. And so she did the Heimlich on me and saved my life. It happened so fast and I kept my cool. So we didn't freak out the kids. The nurse came running up and we're back in our book club discussion. um, anyway, that was an interesting one. But one of the most meaningful ones for me, I was in Hawaii. I made the state list in Hawaii. And I had a private school in Oahu who paid for my trip over, which was just kind of amazing. And I had just given my assembly. And at the end of it, the young teacher who was running the AV system came up to me and he was crying. And he said, I just wish somebody had told my parents it was okay to daydream. He said, we sat through so many school meetings and I was on the hot seat so many times. And I'm fine in life. You know, he's really a creative, artistic young man who found his place eventually in college and beyond. But school was pretty miserable, and his parents really put the pressure on him because they didn't understand a daydreaming kid. So anyway, that was another really special moment. I don't always just connect with the kids, but it's really cool when you connect with the teachers too.
So, what advice would you give to a student to help them get excited about writing?
Read, read, read. And almost always kids who are interested in writing are readers. If reading is hard for a particular kiddo, there's always books books on tape. Now we call them, audible editions. The audible version of Skyriders is fabulous, by the way. That voice actor made me cry. She's made me cry a couple times in both books. She just makes the book so much better.
I might
Um,
have to do that. Maybe I'll do it with because like I actually have my she's only 8 years old, but we listen to audiobooks of about middle grade. So I might have to have her and I listen to it when we're in the car together.
yeah, it's really great. It's really funny. I was driving across Colorado on my way home from some gig, and so I'm listening to her. And I noticed that I'm crying. It's like, wait a second, I wrote this book. How could this woman be making me cry? Because the book doesn't make me cry. When I wrote the scene, of course, I was crying. But it was really fun. The way she performed it was so amazing. How advice for kids. So you want to read, read, read because it gives you a sense of a plot. It also helps build your vocabulary. And oh my gosh, words are the building blocks of stories. So the richer your vocabulary, the more interesting your story is going to be. I don't think most kids in fifth and sixth grade have got the writing chops and craft to be able to sell a book yet. There are a few notable exceptions, but you just keep reading. And then as you get older, at the end of high school and to college, they are buying books from younger and younger writers. So yes, one way to get excited about it is to think about money. Kids want money. Maybe you can pay for your college. There was a kid in Florida named Jake Marchionette, who in 12 years old, homeschooled kid, wrote a book called Just Jake, got an agent, sold it, made the New York Times bestseller list. He is the youngest kid I know that was been successful at writing. But I always take his book when I go to assemblies and say, in schools, and say, look at 12-year-old kid, forget pet sitting. You could be doing this. You could be paying for your college down the road. And
I
then
actually
less time on phones. I think the smartphone is an amazing device, but it is rewiring kids' brains. So they got to unplug from the computers and the iPads and the phones because that's not a good. You've got to be able to practice your daydreaming. Daydreams when you space out and new ideas pop into your mind, and we don't value that enough. It breaks my heart to see kids in cars watching movies, right? That's prime daydreaming time. Think about the daydreaming we did when we were kids, when we were in cars, going places. So that's what my last bit of advice for kiddos.
I know they say that it's good for kids to get bored because then they start to daydream. and that's important. But I'm actually kind of excited because I have, so one of my previous authors have recently contacted me, and he had published a book with his 12-year-old grandson, and they want to be on my podcast. And I'm like, yes, I definitely will take you. And so I'm actually going to have a 12-year-old that helped write a middle grade novel for, I think it's called Nikolai Piccoli. It's what it's called. It might be a little bit younger than middle grade, but I haven't read it yet.
Sounds
So,
terrific.
so you
Wonderful.
obviously are a reader as well. What were some of your favorite books as a child that really stuck with you?
Oh my gosh. So I'm going to give a recommendation. There's a very old book called The 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith. Nobody reads it anymore. And it is just the most wonderful story about these talking Dalmatians. Yes, there's a Cruella de Vil, but the dogs are such terrific characters in the story. I love those. And I certainly love Dr. Dolittle in his early, now I think they're politically incorrect in a number of different ways, but the original story is a great thing. And you will notice that I seem to do this thing with talking animals. I seem to have telepathic dolphins who are real characters in the Neptune Project. And in Skyriders, these sky steeds that are tightly bound to their Skyriders, they magically can speak with their riders. So they have a mind speak link because you have to have the fantasy version of the same communication. So those early books. So yes, I seem to love animal books. I read a lot of horse books. I love the Black Stallion series. I was just a really horsey kid. And as I grew older, then I got into more classical fantasy. Oh, I remember my dad read The Hobbit to me, and then he read The Lord of the Rings. And there was this terrible traumatic moment where I caught him reading ahead. And I just felt so betrayed that my father knew what was going to happen to Frodo before I did. It was a life-changing moment. And I started reading The Fellowship of the Ring by myself after that. So yes, I was
I'm
definitely.
guilty. I'm guilty of that because my daughter can only sit through so much. And then I'm like, oh, I want to know what else happens.
Just don't let her catch you.
All right. So are there any upcoming projects or ideas you've been particularly excited about that you're able to share with us?
Well, kind of waiting to see how Skyriders and the Sky King sell, right? It's a slow build in middle grade. It takes a while for the librarians for a book to percolate out. Especially, I didn't have great luck with reviews. I did not get School Library Journal. I did not get Book List. I did not get Hornbook. And that's sort of the instant way to get the news out there. But I am starting to make some lists. And so librarians on the state committees watch each other's lists, right? So if Skywriters does well enough, because publishers want to make money, then I might be able to write the third book. That is what I did with with the Neptune Project. Disney never did buy the third book. And I self-published that, going back to your question about independent publishing. I still make really nice money on the third Neptune book because I had a platform. There are enough Neptune books out there in school libraries across the country. Kids keep finding the series. They get the first two from the library. And a lot of times the libraries haven't carried the third one. Then they have to go buy it from me. And I get to keep 70% of the profits. But I would really love for the third Skyriders to go through Viking. But we'll just have to see. It's a business. So my Sky Steeds have got to pick up the pace here and sell a few more copies. I am working on coming of age. I think it's really good to flex your writing muscles and try different genres. So I am working on a coming of age set in a mining town. I love historicals. I will say, warning, they are hard to sell. If you look at it every given year, there's maybe one or two that do really well. And somehow it's just because their writing is so fabulous or they have an interesting twist to them. But they are hard to get out there. So I hope this does it. I love this little story and I'm having a great time with it. But one historical story and more advice for your writer listeners. I wrote a circus story. Never quite finished it because my agent didn't like it that much. But it was a traveling wagon circus. And before I had an agent, I took it to an SCBWI conference and an editor, I won a critique. So the editor read a first chapter. We sat down, talked about it. She's a big name editor. It's still out there today. And she said, this first chapter is fabulous. You really can write. But historicals are hard to sell. Why don't you put a vampire in this? I'm looking at her like, what? She really wanted to have paranormal elements, and I wasn't quite sure how I could work a ghost or a vampire. I like ghosts, but I definitely don't like vampires. So I did not put a vampire in my circus story. Make sure you are writing the kind of story that you like to read. I do not like vampires. I knew there's no way I could write a good vampire thing because the whole premise leaves me cold and yeah, right? The thing creatures drinking blood, that does nothing for me. But um, that's how hard it is. She really liked the story and she liked the idea, but she said she just couldn't possibly sell it. You shoot to her sales team or whatever. So historicals are hard, but I like writing them, so I'm going to keep trying until I sell one.
Well, thank you so much for being part of my podcast. But I do want to ask you the one question I ask everybody. It's kind of changed over the year, but what is one thing that you have learned through the writing process of publishing your first book through now?
I think, oh boy, there's so many things, but one thing that just pops into my head is that you do not want to chase the market. You want to be aware of the market. And this is such a hard balancing act. Like, don't chase the market, but know what's going on. You would be foolish not to know what is popular. So my Neptune project is probably the best example. It's hard to sell your first children's book, but I did something pretty smart. I was aware of the fact that dystopian fiction was super hot, but I didn't just chase the market. Like I only wrote it because I love science fiction. Because I love the genre, I thought I could probably do an interesting one, a good one. And then I gave it a fresh twist. So dystopian was hot, but nobody at that time was writing books set in the ocean under the waves. And so by giving it that fresh twist, I had a book that sold in 2 weeks, so it was a really smart thing. So they say don't chase the market, but I do think you need to be aware of the market. And I like to make money from writing, so I'm definitely about I'm about selling books. But then I am realizing here in Steamboat Springs, where I live, there's a writers group where people aren't that interested in selling books. They just want to write. And that can be a beautiful thing too. So whatever you're writing, make sure it's the kind of writing that gets you jazzed. And because writing's hard. And if you aren't writing the kind of thing that you love to read, you're not going to get up and write the next paragraph, write the next chapter. Um, Also, I've learned that you don't have to start a book at the beginning. You can write the middle of the book and go back and write the beginning. Beginnings are really, really hard. So always skip ahead. I can't deal with writer's block. I don't have time for writer's block. So if I get stuck during my writing time, I skip ahead to the most interesting next thing that's going to happen. And that's a whole hodgepodge of advice for you, going all sorts of different directions. But I hope somebody listening to this can get some kernel of useful information from that.
I know that I had my first part, it was already written, but I had to cut wasn't till I finished it that I really knew where the story began. I ended up deleting like several chapters before my story started. But I think that that's very true. Sometimes you can't start at the beginning because you don't really know where the story began until you get to the end.
That happens. And I did have one of my early books that just kept us like, where does this begin? So, the big thing is the inciting incident. But even while you're writing, it's like, what is the inciting incident? Incitare is the Latin word to put into motion. So you got to figure out that moment. So with Harry Potter, it's really the moment he gets a letter to Hogwarts because his life has been going on and on and on. I like to tell kids, look at the Hunger Games. What's the inciting incident? Well, the little sister Primrose's name gets pulled for the reaping.
Right.
So you got to find that moment. And for some stories, it's really, really clear. And some stories, not so much. So you can flounder around at the beginning, but what you want to do is keep pushing forward and get the book written. And then you're really wise. You can go back and decide if you're going to chop off those first 3 or 4 chapters. But maybe you have to write those to know where your story's going and who your character is.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Polly, for being part of my show. I truly do appreciate it. I also want to thank my listeners. If you have been listening for a while, please rate my podcast. This allows not only my podcast to get before more listeners, but my author's books to get before more readers. If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy my conversation with writer Taffeta Chime. She was in high school when she wrote her books. She's the author of the dystopian middle grade novel Studi. I had the privilege of talking with Polly Holyoke today. You can also find them on her website, pollyholyoke.com, POLLYHOLYOKE.com. Thank you so much, Polly. Excuse me. Thank you for joining us at Authors Alcove, the Writing Corner. We hope today's discussion has inspired and informed your writing journey. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review to help us reach more writers like you. And remember, we are brought to you today by the letter K, as in Knowadays, K-N-O-W, knowadays.com, a company that offers many courses from how to become a freelance writer to how to become a proofreader and editor. Also, I'm always appreciative of any of you who support me on Patreon. You can find the links in the show notes. Also, you can check out me at Authors Alcove, the Healing Place, where authors share about their books on healing and recovery. You can also find me at the Authors Alcove, the Reading Nook, where we talk about reading fantasy, sci-fi, and the occasional horror. Until next time, keep writing, keep creating, and we'll see you back in the Writing Corner.